We were on an island off the coast of Maine on a family retreat I'd been assisting with. A camp for both parents as well as their kids, if you will. I'd volunteered after seeing an ad in the classifieds. It sounded like, and it was, a beautiful getaway for families to bond and breathe the freshest of air. There were a few dozen families staying there to try a nature-filled and communal trip to enrich their children's lives. A sort of escape from the turmoil of the city and the suburbs. It was beautiful, with walks through the forest and wood stoves, oil lamps, and a lack of cell phones making it a truly magical place, outside of the fangs and pitfalls of traditional society. The family retreat was on one of the most beautiful islands I'd been to. By far the most lovely place I'd worked in my 40 years on this planet. I was in charge of coordination, scheduling events, exploring the wilderness on long hikes, and just watching over everybody. I rounded the families up for meals and would try to get the kids excited about something aside from a cell phone screen. All was going well until we received a severe storm warning and we knew it would be far too dangerous to try and stay. And we had no choice but to evacuate the island and head inland to Maine. We gathered into a tiny ferry, singing folk songs and eating chips as we rode the choppy waters back to safety on the Rockland of Maine. Do you ever leave the house without your wallet or your keys and you feel naked or exposed? It's a subtle feeling, but it's unmistakable. The dark recesses of your mind yell and wave arms to signal that you are forgetting something you need, and it's almost like a sixth sense, a nagging of your psyche to become whole again. This is what I felt in the following months, with no understanding why. I confirmed with all the families, and every child was accounted for by their parents. Years passed, but this tugging at my well-being would not subside, and I eventually decided to go back to the island to finally put this feeling at rest. It had been 2 years, and I figured I could use a vacation somewhere beautiful anyways. The flight, cab, and ferry were swift, and I'd arrived with no trouble. Memories were flooding back like a familiar book. It felt a bit unsettling to be on the remote island all by myself though. When the ferry shipped off and I watched it drift out of view, I felt an unease I'll never forget. My one tether to civilization drifting off into the dense fog and ocean spray. I hiked up to the vacant lodges, entering the one I'd stayed in 2 years earlier. I unpacked and cooked up some of the canned soup I brought on the wood stove and tried to breathe deeply and relax, watching my cell phone battery dwindle to 25% as the sky darkened into the evening. I loaded the wood stove with more firewood and lit the oil lamp, pacified by the ever-present rustic calm that inhabited this magical island. When I jolted awake, the pale light of the night sky let me know that it was likely around 3 a.m. But I chose not to check my phone as there was no way to charge it and I need to save battery. I heard it this time. Fully awake in the cabin on the empty island, the peculiar moan in a high pitch that was unmistakably that of a small child. My eyes widened and I quickly dressed and grabbed my flashlight, unable to yet truly perceive what I was dreading. I'd left somebody behind. The night chill seeped between my socks and boots as I hiked in the direction of the freakish moan. The dead of night was shadowed in a cold blue. No light pollution aside from the freckles of stars above in the black sky. I stepped over layers of pine needles and twigs headed towards the cabin I recognized as the source of the sound. I opened the heavy wooden door and saw his back. A half-naked child was facing the window. I called out, "Hello?" And he slowly spun around. He looked sick, visibly shaken, but shockingly he was alive. I recognized him after a minute. He had been one of the children on that group trip nearly 2 years ago. "Are you all right?" I asked, overwhelmed that this boy was alive, and he nodded. "Where are your parents?" I asked, then realizing they would have never left him behind intentionally or not returned either. He shook his head and faced the window once more. He was maybe 5 or 6, larger than I remembered, but the face was clear. He was the son of a sweet but distant couple that kept to themselves. It wasn't until I saw him that I realized they hadn't been on the return trip of the ferry either. I was amazed this child was alive. He'd been on a pretty much barren island for around 2 years. It was nothing short of a miracle. I asked him if he was hungry and he shook his head no. "I found a food button," he said plainly, as if it was a common household accessory. "I press it and food comes." I shook my head in disbelief and said, "Excuse me?" He just gazed out the window and said, "When I'm hungry, I press the button and food comes," in his soft, high voice. I was confused at why nobody would just take him off the island. A bit shocked that someone was bringing him food whenever he was hungry. The commute to the island took over an hour. This just didn't make any sense. "Can I see this food button?" I asked, unable to grasp what he exactly meant. The boy just nodded and walked out of the cabin. I followed him into the dark evening air, observing his tics and shivers as he led me up the path to the one place on the island with power. The station was used for emergencies. I used it to organize the evacuation on the island a few years ago. I followed the boy as he entered the lodge and walked over to the radio station, pointing at it with a shaky arm. It was then that I smelled the decay. I knew something was wrong. I just had no idea how wrong until I saw the jagged shapes and the shadows of the adjacent room. They were barely visible, but there was no doubt in my mind that they were human remains, stripped of nearly every inch of meat except for a few strands of cartilage and chewed muscle. Dread poured over me, and I slowly stepped backwards to the door as he said, "I didn't use it this time, and food came anyways." And he began to walk towards me with hungry eyes. I never hit a kid before, but I hope you can forgive my trespass in this scenario as the kid charged towards me, ravenous and wild-eyed. He bit deep into my thigh before I was able to react. He went down with 2 punches, and I was able to tie him up with some bungees I'd brought on the trip back in the past. I waited on that lonely dock until sunrise, when the ferry eventually came. There were dozens of wrecked ships in various states of abandon floating around and crashed ashore on that island. His parents were identified among the dozens of remains in that lodge, as well as those of multiple attempted rescuers who'd responded to his plea of the food button on that VHF radio in that grisly tomb of a lodge.